Welcome to the murder at Blackwater Docks. I'm your host, Holmes's friend, Dr. Watson. Thank you for joining me on another journey, but before we start, let me know from which city are you watching from, and what was the first Sherlock Holmes story you ever heard about? Chapter 1. The Thursday Fisherman. It was on a grey morning in October of the year 1894 that Inspector Lestrade brought us the affair of the Blackwater Docks murder, and with it a set of circumstances so singularly arranged that even Sherlock Holmes, who had spent the better part of that week in ferocious idleness, set down his violin mid-bow and listened with the sharp, unblinking attention of a hawk that has caught the first movement of a field mouse far below. I'd risen early that Friday to find Holmes already occupying his usual chair by the fire, though occupying is perhaps too restful a word. He had the morning edition spread across his knees in a state of massacre, pages torn out, articles circled in red pencil, and the whole of the agony column cut to ribbons and pinned to the mantelpiece with a jackknife. His violin lay across the arm of his chair, and at intervals he would seize it and drag the bow across the strings in a manner that produced not music, but a series of tortured shrieks. "Nothing, Watson," he announced without looking up. "Absolutely nothing. Our London has become a city of dull criminals. A forger in Cheapside who left his own visiting card at the scene. A bigamist in Norwood whose 2 wives attend the same church." "Perhaps you might take the morning air," I suggested. "Fresh air is a poor substitute for a first-rate problem," he replied, and scraped the violin once more. It was at this moment that we heard the rattle of a cab in the street below, followed by a rapid, authoritative knock at our front door. Holmes raised one eyebrow and set aside the violin. "Lestrade," he said. "Official boots, official knock, and the particular energy of a man who has been up all night and wishes someone else to take charge of his difficulties." A moment later, Mrs. Hudson showed Inspector Lestrade into our sitting room. The little detective looked haggard. His overcoat was damp with river fog, and there were traces of Thames mud on his boots. He dropped into the basket chair without ceremony, and accepted the coffee I poured him with the gratitude of a man who has forgotten what warmth feels like. "Well, Lestrade," said Holmes, leaning back with his fingertips pressed together. "You have been at the docks since before dawn. The eastern docks from the colour of that mud, Barking or thereabouts. A body, naturally, and something about it that does not sit comfortably with your theory. Or you would not be here." Lestrade stared at him for a moment, and then shook his head with a resigned expression. "A man named Albert Hargrove," he said, drawing a notebook from his coat. "Found dead last night at Blackwater Docks in Barking. Face down on the fishing platform with his tackle scattered about. A night watchman discovered the body at 9:30. The local surgeon puts the time of death between 7:30 and 8. Cause? Strangulation. Deep ligature mark round the throat. No weapon recovered." Holmes's grey eyes sharpened. "Go on." "It has every mark of a dockside robbery. Rough area, poorly lit, the man alone on a platform at night. But here is the difficulty, Mr. Holmes. Nothing was taken. His pocket watch was still in his waistcoat. His coin purse held £2 and change. And in his coat pocket we found this." Lestrade produced a folded letter and handed it to Holmes, who opened it with careful fingers and read it through twice. I leaned forward, and Holmes tilted it so that I might see. It was written on the heavy cream stationery of a solicitor's office, bearing the heading of one Josiah Trent, Esquire, with chambers in the city. The letter, dated 3 days prior, informed Mr. Albert Hargrove that all arrangements were in order for the transfer of the Hargrove estate, some 1,200 acres of prime farmland and marshland in Essex, bequeathed to him by his late uncle, Mr. Cornelius Hargrove. Mr. Hargrove was requested to attend on Monday morning to sign the deed of transfer. 1,200 acres, I murmured. Rather more than a trifle, Watson. At current Essex land values, we are speaking of an estate worth several £1,000s, and Mr. Hargrove was to formalise this windfall on Monday. Holmes folded the letter and held it to the light, examining the paper. The letter has been opened and refolded. He had read it. Tell me, Lestrade, was the seal intact when you found it? It was unsealed, tucked into his inner coat pocket. And the robber who strangled this man left behind a pocket watch, a coin purse, and a letter announcing that the dead man was about to inherit 1,200 acres of Essex countryside. Holmes allowed himself a thin smile. Your robber is a remarkably incurious fellow. Lestrade shifted uncomfortably. I grant you, it's unusual, but the docks are a rough place. Perhaps the thief was frightened off before he could search the body. And yet the body was carefully arranged face down among the fishing tackle, as though the man had simply collapsed. A thief frightened mid-robbery does not take the time to compose the scene. No, Lestrade. This was a calculated murder made to look like a robbery that never quite committed to the pretense. Lestrade opened his mouth and then closed it again. After a moment he said, There is one other thing. The dead man's wife, Mrs. Margaret Hargrove, has written to you directly. She insists her husband had no enemies. She says he was a quiet man who worked as a shipping clerk and went fishing at Blackwater Docks every Thursday evening. Had done so for 12 years, regular as the tide. Holmes rose from his chair and crossed to the window, where the grey London sky hung low over Baker Street. He stood there for a long moment, his thin figure silhouetted against the glass. Every Thursday, he repeated quietly, for 12 years, the same dock, the same evening, the same hour. A man of fixed habits. And someone knew those habits well enough to find him there, alone, on a dark platform at the water's edge. He turned from the window, and there was a light in his eyes that I had come to recognize. Watson, have you your revolver? In the drawer, as always. Bring it, and your heaviest coat. We are going to the marshes. He turned to Lestrade. Inspector, I shall want the body left precisely where it lies until I've examined the scene. Can you arrange this? I've held the scene since last night, hoping you'd come. Then you are wiser than your superiors give you credit for. We shall take the 10:15 to Barking. Holmes was already reaching for his ulster, and the worn leather bag in which he kept his magnifying lens, measuring tape, and the dozen other instruments of his trade. His entire bearing had transformed. The bored, restless creature of 10 minutes ago had vanished. In his place stood the consulting detective at full alert, poised, purposeful, and dangerous. The train journey to Barking carried us east, through a London that grew steadily grimmer, as the city shed its West End finery and showed its working bones. Rows of terrace houses gave way to factories, and then to the broad, flat marshes bordering the Thames estuary. The October sky was the colour of old pewter, and a thin rain had begun to fall, streaking the carriage windows. Holmes said little during the journey. Lestrade dozed in the corner seat with his hat over his face. Watson, Holmes said at last, as the train slowed for Barking Station, consider the letter. A man is strangled. Nothing is taken, but he carries a document announcing that he is about to inherit a fortune. What does the letter tell us about the killer? That the killer may not have known about the inheritance, or that the killer already knew and did not need the letter, or that the killer deliberately left it to preserve the appearance of a random attack. Each possibility tells a different story. He pulled on his gloves and reached for his hat. The dead speak, Watson, if one knows how to listen, and I suspect Mr. Albert Hargrove has a great deal to say. We alighted at Barking and hired a trap that carried us along rutted lanes towards the river. The air was thick with the smell of the estuary, salt and mud, and the faint vegetable reek of the marshes. Gulls wheeled overhead, crying in the grey air. The landscape was desolate and strangely beautiful, all flat water and pale reeds stretching away towards the distant smudge of the Kent shore. Blackwater Docks announced itself first by its smell, tar and timber and the heavy, oily scent of the river at low tide, and then by its shape, emerging through the rain like a sketch drawn in charcoal. A cluster of warehouses with corrugated iron roofs lined the waterfront, their walls stained black with decades of soot. Beyond them lay the berths where barges and cargo vessels rocked at their moorings, masts and rigging scratching at the sky like bare winter trees. Coils of rope lay everywhere, thick as a man's arm, and the dock planks were worn smooth and dark with age. Lestrade led us along a muddy path that wound between the warehouses and down to the river's edge, where a narrow wooden fishing platform extended some 30 feet over the water. It was here, in at the end of this lonely platform, that Albert Hargrove had drawn his last breath. I could see the shape of the body from 20 yards away, a dark form lying face down on the wet planks, surrounded by the scattered remnants of a fisherman's evening. A rod, a tackle box overturned, a cloth bundle that had once held a man's supper, and beside the body, curled in a tight ball with its nose pressed against the dead man's boot, a small brown and white terrier that raised its head at our approach and regarded us with dark, mournful eyes, but did not bark. Holmes stopped at the foot of the platform and stood very still, taking in the entire scene. The dock, the water, the barges moored nearby, the muddy path behind us, the warehouses standing like silent sentries in the rain. I saw his nostrils flare and his eyes narrow, and I knew that behind that pale, aquiline face, the great engine of his mind was already turning. "Well then," he said softly, and stepped onto the dock. Chapter 2. The Dock of the Dead. Holmes moved along the fishing platform with the slow, deliberate tread of a man crossing a frozen lake, testing each plank before committing his weight. Not because the structure was unsound, it was old but solidly built, but because every inch of that dock was evidence, and Sherlock Holmes treated evidence the way a priest treats a reliquary. "Stay at the foot of the platform. Both of you," he said without turning. "Watson, your notebook. Record everything I say. Lestrade, I shall want to know which of your officers have walked this dock since the body was found." "2 constables and the police surgeon," said Lestrade. "I kept everyone else back." "Their boot sizes?" Lestrade blinked. "I can find out." "Do so. It matters." I stood at the threshold of the platform with my notebook open and my pencil ready, watching Holmes work. In all the years I had observed him at crime scenes, I never grew accustomed to the transformation that came over him in such moments. The languid, irritable creature of Baker Street disappeared entirely. In his place was something closer to a machine, precise, tireless, and utterly without sentiment. He knelt beside the body of Albert Hargrove and studied the dead man's face with an expression that held no pity and no revulsion, only a profound and absolute attention. Our Albert Hargrove had been a man of perhaps 50, sturdily built, with rough hands and a weathered face. Even in death there was a plainness about him, an ordinariness that was itself a kind of dignity. He wore a heavy wool coat, corduroy trousers, and well-worn leather boots caked with dried mud. His fishing rod lay 3 feet from his right hand, the line still trailing into the water. His tackle box had been knocked onto its side, scattering hooks and weights across the planks. A cloth bundle near his left elbow held the remains of bread, cheese, and a flask of cold tea. "He was seated when the attack came," Holmes said, his voice flat and clinical. "Facing the water, legs over the edge of the platform or crossed beneath him. The rod was in his hands or resting across his knees. His supper was beside him, half consumed. He was relaxed, settled. He had been here for some time before the killer arrived." Holmes produced his magnifying lens and bent low over the dead man's throat. I could see, even from my position several yards away, the angry mark that encircled Albert's neck, a deep, livid furrow that ran from just below the left ear around to the right side of the throat, angling slightly upward at the back. The ligature mark is consistent with a thick, rough-textured rope, applied from behind with considerable force. The killer stood above and behind the victim, looped the rope over his head and pulled backward and upward. Death would have come within 2 to 3 minutes. There are no defensive wounds on the hands. Hargrove did not have time to get his fingers beneath the rope. The attack was sudden, and the positioning was decisive. This was not a first attempt by a nervous hand. The killer knew precisely what he intended to do. Holmes took a small envelope from his leather bag and, using a pair of fine tweezers, began extracting something from the edges of the ligature wound. He worked in silence for several minutes, his face inches from the dead man's neck, the magnifying lens held steady in his left hand. "Fibres," he announced at last, "embedded in the wound margins. Black, coarse, and stiff." He held the tweezers up so that I might see. Caught between the tips was a cluster of tiny dark filaments. "Tarred hemp, Watson. The kind used for mooring ropes on river barges. Not a garrote, then. Not a cord or a wire. No, a proper rope, thick, heavy, workmanlike, the kind that lies coiled on every barge and bollard within 200 yards of where we stand." Holmes sealed the fibres in the envelope and wrote upon it in pencil. The killer did not bring an exotic weapon. He used what was already here. He knew this place, knew what materials were available, and selected one that would be indistinguishable from its surroundings once the deed was done. He moved on from the body to examine the dock itself. I watched him crawl on his hands and knees along the full length of the platform, his lens close to the planks, pausing to measure with his tape or mark a spot with white chalk. The rain had eased to a fine mist that beaded on his coat, but he gave no sign of noticing. It was the boot prints that arrested him. The wooden planks of the fishing platform were old and slightly soft, and the persistent damp had left them receptive to impressions. Holmes had been following a set of prints from the landward end of the dock out towards the body when he stopped abruptly and went very still. "Watson, come here. Carefully. Step only where I indicate." I picked my way along the dock, placing my feet on the chalk marks Holmes had laid down to indicate safe passage. When I reached him, he was kneeling between 2 parallel lines of boot prints, his tape measure stretched between them. "Tell me what you see," he said. I looked down. 2 sets of prints. Both appear to be the same size, the same sole pattern, in fact, a heavy tread with a distinctive chevron marking. Good. What else? I studied them more carefully. The 2 lines of prints ran side by side along the dock, both heading outward towards the water. One set was Albert's. That much was evident from the direction and the fact that they terminated at the position where the body lay. But the second set troubled me, and for a moment I could not articulate why. "The stride," I said at last. "The second set has a shorter stride." "By precisely how much?" Holmes stretched the tape between corresponding prints. 3 inches. The first set, Albert's, shows a stride of 31 inches, consistent and even. A man walking at his natural pace, unhurried, carrying his tackle to his usual spot. The second set shows a stride of 28 inches. And there is something else. Look at the heel impressions. I bent lower. In the first set of prints, the heel marks were even, the same depth on left and right. In the second set, the left heel pressed noticeably deeper than the right. "Uneven weight distribution," I said, "heavier on the left." "Precisely. Albert Hargrove walked with a perfectly even gait. The housekeeper will confirm it, and the prints themselves are proof enough. But someone else walked this dock wearing boots of the same size and sole pattern as Albert's, and that someone had a different stride length and a pronounced left heel bias." Holmes rose to his feet and stood looking down at the prints with an expression I knew well, the cold, contained satisfaction of a man who has found what he was looking for. "Someone wore Albert Hargrove's boots, Watson, and that someone walked with a limp." He spent another 10 minutes on the boot prints, measuring every impression, marking the positions with chalk, and recording the data in his own notebook, with the meticulous precision of a surveyor mapping a boundary line. When he was satisfied, he returned to the body and re-examined the solicitor's letter, holding it up to the grey light and reading it once more with minute care. The letter was in his inner coat pocket, Holmes murmured, unsealed. I folded once. He had read it certainly, perhaps more than once. A man does not carry such news carelessly. But consider, Watson, the killer searched nothing, took nothing, left behind a pocket watch worth £3, a coin purse with £2 in silver, and a letter that announces to anyone who reads it that the dead man was about to become a landowner of considerable means. He replaced the letter in the dead man's pocket with the delicacy of a man returning a book to a library shelf. The killer did not need this letter because he already possessed the information it contained, and he did not take it because its removal would have transformed a seemingly random dockside murder into something far more pointed, a killing with an inheritance at its heart. You believe the murder is connected to the estate? I believe a man who was 3 days from signing the deed to 1,200 acres of Essex farmland was strangled on a dark dock by someone who knew his weekly routine, wore his own boots to confuse the prints, and used a weapon sourced from the immediate environment. This was not opportunism, Watson. This was architecture. Holmes made one final circuit of the platform, examining the scattered tackle, the cloth's upper bundle, and the position of the fishing rod. He peered over the edge of the dock at the Blackwater below, then turned his attention to the barges moored along the adjacent berth. There were 3 of them. Heavy, flat-bottomed craft sitting low in the water, their decks cluttered with coils of rope, tarpaulins, and rusted chain. Every barge carried dozens of lengths of mooring line, thick tarred hemp, identical in appearance to the fibres Holmes had extracted from the dead man's wound. He stood at the end of the platform for a long time, staring at those barges, his hands deep in his coat pockets. Lestrade, who had been waiting with admirable patience at the foot of the dock, ventured a question. "Well, Mr. Holmes, what do you make of it?" Holmes did not answer immediately. He was gazing at the nearest barge with fixed concentration. Then he turned and walked back along the platform, stepping over Albert Hargrove's body, and rejoined us on the muddy path. "The weapon is still here, Lestrade," he said quietly. "We are looking at it. Somewhere among those ropes on that barge, there is one length of tarred hemp that was cut and used to strangle Albert Hargrove. Yes, and then tied back among its fellows where no one would think to look for it. A needle hidden in a stack of needles." He paused and looked back at the dock, where the small terrier had resumed its vigil beside its dead master. "Have the body moved to the mortuary now? I have learned what the dead man has to teach me. It is time to hear what the living have to say." Chapter 3. The Widow and the Dog. Albert Hargrove's home was a modest brick cottage on a quiet lane half a mile from the docks. Dead leaves lay in drifts against the front step, and the curtains were drawn across every window. It was the house of a man who had lived simply and asked little of the world, and it wore its grief the way such houses do, not with drama, but with a kind of stillness that pressed upon the chest. A stout or red-eyed woman in a black dress answered our knock. This was Mrs. Phelps, the housekeeper, who had clearly been crying, and showed every intention of continuing. She admitted us to a small front parlour, where a coal fire burned low in the grate, and there we found Margaret Hargrove. I had expected something more fragile. The wives of murdered men so often present themselves as creatures shattered beyond function. Margaret Hargrove was not such a woman. She was perhaps 45, with a strong and square face and dark hair pulled severely back. Her eyes were swollen from tears, but her hands were steady in her lap, and her voice carried the flat composure of a person who has absorbed a blow and resolved to stand upright regardless. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Holmes," she said. "I wrote to you because I know the police believe my husband was killed by some dock ruffian, and I know they are wrong. Albert had no enemies. He was the gentlest man I have ever known. Holmes settled into the chair opposite her, with the quiet, attentive manner he reserved for witnesses he respected. He listened the way a physician listens, leaning forward, his grey eyes on the speaker's face, with an expression of unhurried interest that invited confidence. "Tell me about your husband, Mrs. Hargrove. His habits, his work, his character. Spare no detail, however small." Margaret drew a breath and began. Albert had worked for 23 years as a clerk at Hartley & Sons, a shipping firm in Barking. He was not ambitious and had never sought promotion. He was content with his modest salary, his garden, his dog, and his Thursday evenings at the docks. He had fished the same platform at Blackwater every Thursday for 12 years, departing at 5:30 and returning between 10 and 11. He brought the same supper each week. He brought the same dog. He was a creature of routine, Margaret said, with the ghost of a smile. You could set the parish clock by Albert. "And the inheritance," said Holmes. "When did you first learn of it?" The smile faded. 5 weeks ago, when Uncle Cornelius died, we attended the reading of the will. Everyone expected Victor to inherit. He had managed parts of the estate for years and made no secret of his expectations. When the solicitor read Albert's name as sole heir, the room went very quiet. Our Victor looked as though he had been struck. How did Albert receive the news? With bewilderment, mostly. He could not understand why Cornelius had chosen him. They were not close. Albert visited his uncle perhaps twice a year. But Cornelius was a shrewd old man, Mr. Holmes, and I believe he saw something in Albert that others overlooked. A steadiness, a decency. Cornelius did not trust Victor's appetites. Victor's appetites. Victor lives beyond his means. He always has. Fine clothes, fine lodgings, expensive tastes. Albert once said Victor spent money the way a man with a fever drinks water, desperately and without satisfaction. Holmes considered this. You mentioned that Victor visited last week. Yes, last Wednesday. He came for tea. He was polite, as he always is, but there was something strained about him. He kept turning the conversation back to the estate, when the transfer would be complete, whether Albert had spoken with the solicitor. Oh, what Albert intended to do with the land. Albert answered honestly, as was his nature. He told Victor everything, including the date of the Monday appointment with Mr. Trent. Margaret paused. I believe so, yes. Albert saw no reason to conceal it. Holmes nodded slowly. He glanced at me, and I saw a faint tightening at the corner of his mouth, the suppressed expression of a man whose suspicion has just received its first quiet confirmation. Mrs. Hargrove, I must ask you about the household. Who else lives here? Only myself, Mrs. Phelps, and the children. Edward is 12 and Clara is 8. They are upstairs with Mrs. Phelps's daughter at present. I did not want them to hear. She stopped and pressed her lips together. Of course, Holmes said gently. And the dog. It was at this mention that I became aware of the animal. The small brown and white terrier I had seen lying beside the body at Blackwater Docks was now curled on a rug before the fire, its chin resting on its paws. It had not stirred at our entrance. It did not raise its head. It lay with the absolute stillness of a creature that has lost its compass point and does not know where to direct itself. Patch, said Margaret. He always went with Albert to the docks, always. Albert would not go without him. I spoke up, for this was the observation forming in my mind since the previous day. Mrs. Hargrove, when the watchman found your husband, Patch was lying beside him, perfectly calm, not agitated, not barking. Margaret looked at me with a puzzled expression. Patch would not leave Albert's side. He would stay with him until someone came. Yes, but the point is this. Patch was calm. I looked at Holmes. A terrier is a loyal and protective breed. If a stranger had attacked Albert, Patch would have barked loud enough to rouse every watchman on the waterfront, but he did nothing. Holmes regarded me with an expression of quiet approval that I valued more than any spoken compliment. Watson has struck upon precisely the point. The dog did not bark because the dog did not perceive a threat, which means the killer was not a stranger. The killer was someone Patch knew, someone familiar. You are saying, she whispered, that Albert was killed by someone he knew. I am saying that the evidence points in that direction, and I shall follow it wherever it leads. Holmes's voice was firm but not unkind. Now, I must ask about one more matter, and I ask you to forgive me for raising it. Mrs. Phelps, would you come in? Please. The housekeeper appeared in the doorway, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief the size of a small tablecloth. Mrs. Phelps, your mistress mentioned that Mr. Hargrove kept a pair of spare wading boots. Where were they stored? In the garden shed, sir, on the shelf beside the potting soil. Mr. Hargrove kept them for when the dock was muddy. He'd change into them before he set out. And when did you last see them? Mrs. Phelps frowned. I couldn't say exactly, sir. I was in the shed last Saturday to fetch the garden shears, and I don't recall seeing them, but I wasn't looking. They may have been gone before that. Were the boots distinctive? Heavy brown leather, sir, with a thick chevron sole. Mr. Hargrove bought them from Grafton's in Barking High Street 2 years ago. Size 9. Holmes exchanged a glance with me. Size 9. The same size as the prints on the dock. Both sets of them. Thank you, Mrs. Phelps. One final question. Has anyone visited the garden shed recently? Any family, tradesmen, visitors? Mrs. Phelps thought. Only Mr. Victor, sir. He came last Wednesday for tea with the mistress and master, and I saw him walk through the garden afterwards. He said he wanted to look at Mr. Hargrove's rose bushes. I thought it odd. Mr. Victor has never shown the slightest interest in roses. Holmes rose from his chair. You have been most helpful, Mrs. Phelps. As we moved towards the door, Holmes paused and turned back to Margaret. His manner shifted. Something more careful entered his bearing, the delicacy of a surgeon approaching a sensitive area. Mrs. Hargrove, I must raise one further matter. It has come to my attention that you have been conducting a private correspondence with a gentleman in Colchester. The effect was immediate. Margaret's composure cracked. Colour flooded her cheeks and her hands seized the arms of her chair. That is a private matter, Mr. Holmes. It has nothing to do with Albert's death. In a murder investigation, secrets are obstacles. I must ask you to remove them. I will not discuss it, she said, and her jaw set with a firmness that told me this woman could not be easily moved. It is personal and innocent, and I will say nothing more. Holmes held her gaze for a long moment, then inclined his head. Very well, but I would urge you to reconsider. In my experience, the secrets that seem most private are often the ones that matter most. We left the cottage and walked in silence along the lane towards the main road. The afternoon was drawing in, and the grey sky had deepened to the colour of slate. Somewhere behind us, in that still and grieving house, a small terrier lay before a dying fire and waited for a master who would never return. The dog, Watson, Holmes said at last. The dog is the key that unlocks the first door. We are not looking for a stranger. We are looking for someone in Albert Hargrove's circle. Someone the terrier knew well enough to ignore on a dark dock while his master was being murdered. And the boots? Stolen from the garden shed, almost certainly during Victor's visit last Wednesday. He walked through the garden. Mrs. Phelps saw him. He has never shown the slightest interest in roses. Holmes thrust his hands into his pockets and quickened his pace. We have a victim of fixed habits, a cousin with strained finances and intimate knowledge of those habits, a pair of stolen boots that matched the dead man's prints, and a dog that did not bark. The picture is forming, Watson. It is not yet complete, but the outline is becoming very clear indeed. Chapter 4. The Cousins' Quarrel. Victor Hargrove lived in a narrow townhouse on a respectable street in Stratford, the kind of address that announces its occupant is a man of some standing, or wishes the world to think so. The house was freshly painted, and the brass knocker polished, but the curtains in the upper windows were thin and faded, and the boot scraper by the door was cracked. It was a house that kept up appearances the way a sick man keeps up his collar, desperately, and from the outside only. A manservant admitted us to a drawing-room that continued the theme. The furniture was good, but not new. The carpet had been turned to conceal worn patches. Everything spoke of a household that had once been comfortable, and was now holding on by its fingernails. Victor Hargrove entered a few minutes later. He was a man of 37 or 38, well-made, with a handsome face that might have been called striking were it not so tightly drawn. His dark hair was neatly oiled, and he wore a charcoal suit of good cloth, though the cuffs showed the faintest shine of wear. His manner as he shook our hands was polished and correct. But I am a medical man, and the body tells truths that manners conceal. Victor's fingernails were bitten to the quick. A muscle in his jaw twitched at irregular intervals. His eyes moved too quickly, flicking from Holmes to me with the restless watchfulness of a man calculating something behind every glance. And when he sat, he gripped the arm of his chair with his left hand hard enough to whiten the knuckles. "A terrible business, Mr. Holmes," Victor said, crossing one leg over the other with a casualness that did not extend to his eyes. I still cannot quite believe it. Albert and I were not the closest of cousins, but we were family. The thought that someone would do this to him, at his fishing spot of all places, is beyond comprehension. "You were aware of his Thursday habit?" Holmes asked. Everyone in the family knew. Albert was the most predictable man in Essex. Every Thursday, rain or shine, down to those docks with his rod and his little dog. Victor shook his head. I told him more than once that it wasn't safe. The docks are no place for a man alone after dark. "And the inheritance? You were present at the reading of the will?" A change came over Victor's face, very slight, very quickly suppressed, but I saw it. A tightening around the eyes, a fractional stiffening of the jaw. It was there for barely a second before the mask of composure resettled itself. I was. Uncle Cornelius left everything to Albert. I won't pretend I wasn't surprised. I had managed portions of the estate for some years, and I suppose I had certain expectations. But a man's will is his own affair, and I accepted the decision. "Graciously, I hope," said Holmes. Victor's smile did not reach his eyes. "As graciously as one can when one's expectations are overturned. But I bore Albert no ill will, Mr. Holmes. He did not ask for the inheritance. It was Cornelius's choice. And Cornelius was, well, he was a peculiar old man. Where were you on Thursday evening, Mr. Hargrove?" "I dined at the Creekmouth Inn. I arrived around 8:15 and stayed through supper. The innkeeper, Mr. Burrows, can confirm it." "You dined alone?" "I did. I often take my supper there when I'm in the area. The food is tolerable and the company undemanding." "And what brought you to the area on that particular evening?" Another flicker behind the eyes. "I had business at the warehouses earlier in the day, a storage lease I've been considering. Afterwards, I decided to take supper locally rather than return to Stratford." Holmes nodded as though this answer satisfied him entirely. He asked several more questions of a general nature: Victor's relationship with Albert, his knowledge of the Hargrove estate, his own financial circumstances. To each, Victor gave smooth, measured replies. He expressed no opinion on who might have killed his cousin. He offered no theories. He was helpful without being forthcoming, cooperative without being candid, the performance of a man who has rehearsed his lines and knows his cue. As we rose to leave, Holmes paused at the door and turned back with the air of a man who has just remembered a trifle. "One small matter, Mr. Hargrove. You said you arrived at the Creekmouth Inn at 8:15. Oh, did you go directly to your table?" "I believe so, yes." You did not, for instance, spend any time in the back of the establishment, washing up perhaps? For the first time, something shifted in Victor's composure. It was not alarm exactly, more a sudden awareness, like a man who hears a twig snap in a dark wood. I may have washed my hands before sitting down. One does after a day at the warehouses. Naturally, said Holmes. Good afternoon, Mr. Hargrove. We said nothing until we were well clear of the house and walking briskly towards the Creekmouth Inn, which lay a mile to the east along a lane that ran parallel to the river. The afternoon was cold, and the wind off the estuary carried the smell of low tide and distant rain. His hands, Watson, Holmes said. Did you observe them? Bitten nails, nervous tension. More than that. When he gripped the chair arm, his right palm was turned partially upward. The creases of the palm and the skin between the thumb and forefinger were stained. Faintly, but distinctly. A dark discoloration that no amount of washing has entirely removed. Ink! He is a man of business. Ink does not produce that particular colour, nor does it settle into the skin creases in that pattern. It is tar, Watson. Stockholm tar, the same compound that coats every mooring rope at Blackwater Docks. I felt a cold sensation settle in my chest. You think he handled the rope? I think a gentleman who dines at country inns does not ordinarily acquire tar stains on his palms. But we shall see. The inn first. The Creekmouth Inn was a low, rambling establishment of blackened timber and whitewashed plaster, set back from the lane behind a yard of packed earth where a few chickens scratched in the fading light. It had the look of a place that had been serving ale since the Tudors, and saw no reason to alter its methods. The public room was warm and dim, smelling of pipe smoke and mutton, and behind the bar stood a heavy, florid man with the cautious eyes of a publican who has learned to observe without appearing to. This was Mr. Burrows, and he confirmed readily enough that Mr. Victor Hargrove had visited the inn on Thursday evening. "A regular, is he?" Holmes asked, settling onto a stool at the bar with the ease of a man who has spent a lifetime extracting information from reluctant sources over a pint of ale. "Semi-regular, I'd say. Comes in perhaps once a fortnight. Always alone. Polite enough. Tips fair." "And on Thursday evening? What time did he arrive?" Burrows rubbed his chin. "I'd say around 8:15, maybe a bit after. He came in through the front door looking a bit rushed." "Rushed in what way?" Breathing hard. "Like he'd been walking fast. His face was red from the wind. Or so I assumed. He didn't come to the bar. Went straight through to the back. We have a washroom for guests." "And how long was he in the back before he sat down to eat?" Burrows thought carefully. "Well, now. I had the clock above the bar, and I remember because I was keeping an eye on the stew. Mrs. Burrows's stew waits for no man, and I was meant to take it off the heat at 8:30. He didn't come out and sit down until the stew was nearly done. I'd say close to 40 minutes past 8. 25 minutes perhaps from when he walked in." 25 minutes washing his hands, Holmes repeated mildly. Burrows shrugged. "I didn't think much of it at the time. Some gentlemen are particular." "And when he did emerge, did you notice anything about his appearance?" "His hands were very clean," Burrows said, with the careful emphasis of a man who is trying to be precise. "Scrubbed pink, and he'd changed his collar, or turned it maybe. When he came in, I thought I noticed a dark mark on his collar, but when he sat down, it was gone. Could be I was mistaken." "You are a most observant innkeeper, Mr. Burrows." We left the Creekmouth Inn as the last light was draining from the sky. Holmes walked in silence for some distance, his face sharp and intent. 25 minutes, Watson. He arrives breathless at 8:15. He spends 25 minutes in the back washing himself, and does not sit down to eat until 20 to 9. Albert Hargrove was killed between 7:30 and 8 o'clock. The walk from the fishing platform at Blackwater Docks to the Creekmouth Inn takes, well, we shall measure it precisely, but I estimate 18 minutes at a brisk pace. I did the arithmetic. If he killed Albert at 7:45 and walked fast, he would arrive at the inn at roughly 8:05. Add 10 minutes for removing the stolen boots, disposing of the rope. 8:15, precisely the time Burrows saw him walk in, breathless and tar-stained. Holmes's voice was quiet and level, but beneath the calm I could hear the hard edge of certainty. The alibi is not an alibi, Watson. It is a confession written in minutes and boot leather. As we waited for the evening train back to London, a telegram arrived from Lestrade. Our Scotland Yard had identified 2 additional suspects. Thomas Slade, the dock foreman who had argued publicly with Albert 2 weeks before the murder, and a Scandinavian sailor named Eric Lindqvist, who had been seen near the docks on Thursday evening. Lestrade considered both men strong leads and intended to bring them in for questioning. Holmes read the telegram, folded it, and slipped it into his pocket without comment. But as the train carried us westward through the darkening Essex marshes, he murmured, almost to himself, "Lestrade will chase his dock foreman and his foreign sailor, and he will find nothing. The answer to this case does not lie among strangers, Watson. It lies in a family." Chapter 5. The rough men of Blackwater Sunday brought a break in the weather. A hard, clear morning with a cold blue sky and a wind that cut like a razor off the estuary. Holmes had been up since before dawn. When I came down to breakfast, I found him at the table with a large-scale ordnance map of the Barking Marshes, upon which he had drawn careful lines in red ink connecting the fishing platform, the warehouse district, and the Creekmouth Inn. "We are going back to the docks," he announced. "Lestrade's 2 suspects must be examined and dismissed before they clog the investigation. The sooner we clear the innocent, the sooner the guilty man stands alone." "You are certain they are innocent?" Holmes set down his pencil and regarded me with an expression that held, for the first time in this case, a flicker of genuine uncertainty. "I am nearly certain, but nearly is a word I do not care for in a murder investigation. One of these men may surprise us, Watson. The facts point strongly towards Victor, but facts are only as reliable as their arrangement, and I have been wrong before. Twice, to be precise, but both times because I allowed a compelling theory to blind me to a contradicting detail." We took the morning train to Barking and made our way first to the lodging house near the docks where Thomas Slade kept his rooms. Slade was a big man, broad across the shoulders, thick through the arms, with hands like coal shovels and a face that had been rearranged by some past violence into an expression of permanent belligerence. He met us at his door in his shirt sleeves, unshaven, and regarded Holmes with the hostile suspicion of a man who has spent his life on the wrong end of authority. "I've already spoken to the police," he said, blocking the doorway. "I told them everything I know, which is nothing." "Then you will have no difficulty telling me," Holmes replied pleasantly. "I shall be brief." Slade let us in with poor grace. His room was small and sparse, a bed, a chair, a table with a tin plate, the quarters of a man who earned his living with his back. "You had an argument with Albert Hargrove," Holmes began. 2 weeks before his death, over fishing rights on the dock." Slade's jaw tightened. "It was nothing. He fished on the platform every Thursday, and I told him the company wanted those platforms cleared for cargo work. He said he'd been fishing there for 12 years and he wasn't about to stop. We had words. That was the end of it." "Did you threaten him?" "I told him he'd have to move his tackle, or I'd move it for him. Now that's not a threat, that's a fact, but I never touched the man. He was a decent sort, quiet, kept to himself. I had no quarrel with him beyond the platforms." "Where were you on Thursday evening between 7 and 9 o'clock?" "At the Waterman's Arms, playing cards. I was there from 6 till closing, and there's 4 men who'll tell you the same." Holmes produced his notebook. "Their names?" Slade gave 4 names without hesitation, dock workers and bargemen who played cards at the Waterman's Arms every Thursday. Holmes wrote them down, asked several further questions about the layout of the docks and the schedules of the night watchmen, and then made a request that clearly puzzled Slade. "Would you stand, please, and hold out your hands?" Slade rose, scowling, and extended his hands palms upward. Holmes examined them through his lens with the same minute attention he had given to the ligature wound on Albert's throat. Slade's hands were enormous, scarred, calloused, the nails cracked and black with ingrained dirt. The calluses were those of a man who handled rope and chain daily, thick ridges across the palms and at the base of each finger. "Now, your boots, if you please." Slade kicked off one boot, and Holmes measured it against a paper template he produced from his bag. The boot was a size 12, 3 full sizes larger than the prints on the dock. Holmes paused. Something in his manner shifted, a slight stiffening, a narrowing of the eyes. He reached for the boot again and turned it over, studying the sole. "Mr. Slade, you said the company wished to clear the fishing platforms for cargo work. Whose decision was that?" "The shipping agent's, Mr. Hartley." "Albert's employer?" "The same." "And did Mr. Hartley know that Albert fished at Blackwater every Thursday?" Slade's expression darkened. "Hartley knew everything about those docks. He's had men watching the platforms for months. Something about insurance, liability for trespassers on company property. He told me to document who was using the platforms and when. I wrote it all down in the foreman's log. Names, days, times." I saw Holmes absorb this with a flicker of interest that he did not attempt to conceal. A foreman's log documenting Albert's exact schedule, available to anyone with access to the dock office. "Available to anyone who asked for it," Slade corrected. "It hung on a nail behind the foreman's desk. Half the dock knew it was there." Holmes recorded this in his notebook, his pencil moving rapidly. "And did anyone ask for it? In the weeks before the murder?" Slade thought. "Mr. Victor came in once. The second time he visited the warehouse, I think. He asked to see the foreman's log. He said he was checking on cargo deliveries. I didn't think anything of it. He'd been around the docks for years on estate business." "But the foreman's log does not record cargo deliveries." "No. It records personnel and platform usage. If he wanted cargo records, he'd have gone to Jessup in the warehouse office." Holmes regarded Slade for a long moment. "Thank you, Mr. Slade. You've been more cooperative than you know." "Does that mean I'm in the clear?" Slade asked, with a gruffness that did not entirely conceal his relief. "It means you may continue your card games with an untroubled conscience. One further question. In your time as dock foreman, were you ever dismissed from a previous position?" Slade went very still. The colour crept up his thick neck. "That's got nothing to do with this." "It has nothing to do with the murder, no. But it explains why you were so hostile to the police, and why Lestrade found you suspicious. That's you were dismissed from the Tilbury Yards for theft, a coil of copper wire, if I recall the report correctly. You feared that a murder investigation would unearth your record and cost you your current position." Slade said nothing, but the look on his face confirmed everything. Holmes touched the brim of his hat and we left. "Eliminated as a suspect," Holmes said as we crossed the yard, "but not as a witness. Slade has given us something valuable, the foreman's log. See, Victor did not merely scout the docks with his own eyes. He consulted the log that recorded Albert's exact schedule, written in an official hand, with times and dates. That is premeditation documented by a third party." We found Eric Lindqvist at the cargo berths, supervising the unloading of timber from a Swedish vessel at berth 7. He was a tall, fair-haired man with a seaman's weathered face and pale eyes that regarded us with wary reserve. Holmes had arranged for a translator, a young clerk from the harbour master's office who spoke passable Swedish. And through this intermediary we conducted our interview on the deck of the cargo vessel, surrounded by stacked timber and the cries of gulls. Lindqvist's account was straightforward. His vessel, the Sigrid, had docked at berth 7 at 7 o'clock on Thursday evening. Berth 7 was 3 berths south of the fishing platform, a distance of perhaps 200 yards. Lindqvist and his crew had spent the evening unloading timber under lantern light. He had not left the vessel or the immediate berth at any point during the evening. He had never met Albert Hargrove, and did not know the fishing platform existed until the police told him about the murder. Holmes listened with his usual patience, then asked a question that shifted the tone of the interview entirely. Ask him whether any of his crew left the vessel during the unloading. The exchange that followed produced a visible change in Lindqvist. He spoke rapidly, then stopped, then spoke again more slowly, choosing his words with care. He says all crew remained at berth 7 during the unloading, the translator reported. But he hesitates. He says one of his men, the bosun, a man named Anderson, went to the dock office at approximately 7:30 to file the cargo manifest with the night clerk. Anderson was gone for perhaps 20 minutes. Holmes's expression sharpened. 20 minutes, and the route from berth 7 to the dock office passes within 50 yards of the fishing platform. Lindqvist understood enough English to grasp the implication. He spoke rapidly and emphatically, gesturing towards the vessel. He says Anderson is a good man. He has sailed with him for 6 years. Anderson would not harm anyone. I should like to speak with Anderson. Anderson was produced, a squat, powerful man with thick forearms and a face browned by salt wind. Holmes examined his hands and boots with the same meticulous care he had brought to Slade. The boots were heavy sea boots with a flat, ridged sole, utterly unlike the chevron pattern found on the dock. The hands were a sailor's hands, calloused, rope-burned, and stained with pine resin from the timber cargo. Pine resin, Holmes murmured, not tar. Pine resin is sticky, pale and fragrant. Stockholm tar is dark, smooth and acrid. The two cannot be confused. He confirmed through the harbour master's log that the Sigrid's crew had been accounted for throughout the evening, with the night watchman noting their lantern light at berth 7 continuously from 7 o'clock until nearly midnight. The dock office night clerk confirmed that a foreign sailor had filed a manifest at approximately 7:30 and departed within 5 minutes, not the 20 minutes Lindqvist had estimated. Eliminated, Holmes said as we walked away, but not trivially. Lindqvist's initial evasiveness was genuine, and the bosun's 20-minute absence, which proved to be only 5, could have been significant in other circumstances. The difference between a real suspect and a cleared witness sometimes hangs on the distinction between pine resin and Stockholm tar. Ask him why he was nervous when the police questioned him, I ventured, recalling the earlier tension. Holmes permitted himself a thin smile. I already know. The cargo manifest does not perfectly match the actual cargo. There are certain items, spirits, tobacco, perhaps a few bolts of cloth, that were not declared at customs. Petty smuggling, Watson. A common enough practice among merchant sailors, and entirely irrelevant to our investigation. But it explains why Lindqvist was evasive with the police, and why his behaviour aroused suspicion. We had cleared both of Lestrade's suspects in under 2 hours, but the morning had not been wasted. Holmes led me back through the dock district at a brisk pace, past the warehouses and the cargo sheds, his mind working visibly behind his grey eyes. The foreman's log, he said, almost to himself. Father Victor consulted it. He did not merely observe Albert's routine from a distance, he verified it in writing. He wanted certainty. He wanted to know, beyond any doubt, that Albert would be on that platform at that hour on that evening. He paused and looked back towards the river, where the masts of the barges at Blackwater rose against the cold blue sky. Tomorrow we visit the warehouse office and the solicitor. The foundation is laid, Watson, and now we build the case. Chapter 6. The Ledger and the Liar. Monday morning found us once more on the train to Barking. Holmes sat in the corner of our compartment with his eyes half closed and his fingers steepled beneath his chin, and I knew that behind that mask of repose the machinery of his mind was running at full capacity, sorting and weighing and connecting, building the architecture of a case that would bear the weight of proof. The Blackwater Docks warehouse office was a cramped, wood-panelled room at the end of the main warehouse building, heated by a paraffin stove that filled the air with a greasy warmth. Behind the counter sat a thin, spectacled clerk named Jessup, a man of 50-odd years with ink-stained fingers and the cautious demeanour of a functionary who has spent his career recording other men's business. Holmes introduced himself and asked to see the visitor's log. Jessup produced a heavy ledger bound in green cloth, its pages ruled into columns for date. He columns until it stopped, tapped twice, columns until it stopped, tapped twice, and moved on. It stopped again, and again. "Here," he said, turning the ledger so that I could see. "Victor Hargrove, signed in on the 2nd of October, purpose of visit, inspection of storage lease. Again on the 5th of October, same purpose. And again on the 9th, 3 days before the murder. 3 visits in 2 weeks. I looked at Holmes. The lease he mentioned. The lease that does not exist. Holmes turned to Jessup. "Mr. Jessup, can you tell me the status of Victor Hargrove's storage lease at this facility?" Jessup adjusted his spectacles. Mr. Hargrove held a lease on Bay 14 for the storage of estate goods. Furniture, farm equipment, that sort of thing. The lease expired 6 months ago and was not renewed. The bay has been empty since April. And yet Mr. Hargrove signed your log 3 times in the past fortnight, citing inspection of this same lease. He did, sir, and I thought it peculiar. I mentioned to him on his second visit that the lease had lapsed, and he said he was considering renewing it. But he never filed the paperwork, and on his third visit, he didn't go near Bay 14 at all." Holmes leaned forward. "Where did he go?" Jessup hesitated. "And on his last 2 visits, Mr. Hargrove on his last 2 visits. Mr. Hargrove walked past the warehouse bays and continued down towards the river, towards the fishing platforms." "Did he ask you any questions during his visits?" "On his first visit, he asked which platforms were used for fishing and whether they were busy in the evenings. I told him the only regular was Mr. Albert Hargrove, Thursday evenings like clockwork. On his second visit, he asked what time the dock grew quiet. I told him most workers leave by 6 and the night watchman doesn't begin rounds until 9. Holmes closed the ledger and sat back. "Mr. Jessup, you have the soul of a detective. 3 visits to inspect a lease that had expired 6 months earlier. No paperwork filed, no renewal arranged. Instead, the visitor walks to the fishing platforms and asks pointed questions about who uses them and when the dock is empty." He paused. "Did Mr. Hargrove ask anything else?" "Anything at all?" Jessup thought. "On his last visit, the 9th, he asked whether the barges at berth 4 were permanent moorings, or whether they moved on. I told him those barges hadn't shifted in months. They're laid up for the winter." "Berth 4? You have been invaluable, Mr. Jessup." "You have been invaluable, Mr. Jessup. I may need you to repeat these observations to a magistrate in due course. I trust you would be willing." Jessup straightened in his chair with the quiet pride of a man who has been told his work matters. "I would, sir. And I keep careful records, and I remember what I see." We left the warehouse office and walked in silence to the main road, where we hired a cab to take us into the city. Holmes was quiet for the first 10 minutes of the journey, his eyes fixed on the passing streets, his jaw set. "Premeditation, Watson," he said at last. "Proved beyond doubt. Victor did not visit those docks to inspect a storage lease. He visited them to study the ground. Albert's routine, when the dock was empty, are where the mooring ropes were kept. 3 visits in a fortnight. The careful reconnaissance of a man planning a murder. And now we know he also consulted the foreman's log. Slade's record of who used the platforms and when. He left nothing to chance. And the clerk will testify to all of it. Every word backed by his own ledger. Jessup is the kind of witness a prosecutor dreams of. Precise, methodical, utterly without imagination. He will state what he saw, and a jury will believe every syllable. The chambers of Mr. Josiah Trent occupied the second floor of a sombre building on Throgmorton Street. Trent himself was a lean, dry man of 60, with silver hair and steel-rimmed spectacles through which he regarded the world with the measured scepticism of a man who has spent 40 years reading wills and has learned never to be surprised by the greed of families. And he received us in a panelled office lined with deed boxes and listened to Holmes's introduction with attentive stillness. "I am investigating the murder of your client Albert Hargrove," Holmes said. "I believe the murder is connected to the estate." Trent steepled his fingers. "I owe a duty of confidentiality, Mr. Holmes. But Albert is dead, and if his murder is connected to the estate, I suppose I must help where I can. What do you wish to know?" "The will of Cornelius Hargrove. Albert was named sole heir. What happens to the estate if Albert dies before the deed transfer is complete?" Something shifted in Trent's expression, a faint, grim satisfaction, as though he had been waiting for someone to ask this question. "That is precisely the point on which the entire matter turns, Mr. Holmes. Cornelius Hargrove was a careful man, and he employed a careful solicitor, if I may say so. His will contains a primary clause leaving the estate to Albert, and a secondary clause that addresses the very circumstance you describe. And that secondary clause states that, in the event of Albert's death before the transfer is complete, the estate passes in its entirety to Albert's surviving children, to be held in trust until they reach the age of majority, not to the next of kin, not to any other member of the Hargrove family, to the children." The words fell into the room like stones dropped into still water. I looked at Holmes. "Or age 12 and Clara aged 8. Age 12 and Clara aged 8. "Correct. Under the secondary clause they inherit everything. 1,200 acres, the farmhouse, the marshland, the tenancies, all of it. Mrs. Margaret Hargrove would serve as custodian until they come of age. And Victor Hargrove, the next of kin, inherits nothing. Nothing whatsoever. The secondary clause was specifically designed to prevent the estate from passing through intestacy to any collateral relative. Cornelius was quite explicit on this point. He told me—" Trent paused, as though deciding whether to cross a line, then continued. "He told me that he did not trust his nephew Victor and wished to ensure that under no circumstances could Victor benefit from Albert's death." Holmes exhaled slowly. Cornelius foresaw the danger. Cornelius was not a sentimental man. While he knew his family, he knew Victor's debts, Victor's character, and Victor's expectations. He chose Albert precisely because Albert would neither squander the land nor scheme to acquire it. Did Victor know about the secondary clause? He did not. Victor came to this office 4 weeks ago in considerable agitation. He demanded to see the full text of the will. I refused. He threatened legal action and said the will was unjust. I told him he had no grounds. He left in a rage. But he did not learn of the secondary clause. No, the clause was not read at the public will reading. Only the primary bequest was announced. The secondary provisions are detailed in a private codicil that I hold in this office. Victor never saw it. Holmes sat in silence for several seconds. When he spoke, his voice was very quiet. Then Victor Hargrove murdered his cousin under a fatal misapprehension. He believed that by killing Albert before the deed transfer, the estate would pass to him as next of kin through intestacy. He did not know that Cornelius had anticipated precisely this possibility and had blocked it. That is the tragic irony of it, Mr. Holmes. If Victor killed Albert to inherit, and I make no accusation, then he killed for nothing. The estate was never going to be his. We descended the stairs into the noise of Throgmorton Street. Holmes stood on the pavement and looked up at the grey sky. His expression held something I seldom saw in him, not pity, but a cold recognition of the waste that human greed produces. He killed a good man for an inheritance he would never have received, Holmes said. Cornelius, from beyond the grave, had already ensured it. Victor strangled his cousin on a dark dock, disposed of the rope, walked to an inn to wash the tar from his hands. All for nothing. The estate will go to Albert's children. Exactly as Cornelius intended. Will you tell Victor? At the moment it will do the most damage to his composure. Not yet. Holmes raised his hand for a cab. We have the clues, the motive, the premeditation. What we need now is the financial pressure that drove a desperate man to murder. Tomorrow we visit Mr. Silas Crook. Chapter 7. The Moneylender's Shadow. Limehouse in the autumn of 1894 was not a district that invited casual visitors. The streets were narrow and crooked, as the buildings pressed together like conspirators, and the air carried the mingled stench of the river and the tanneries. Holmes moved through this landscape with the easy familiarity of a man who had walked its alleys 100 times in a dozen disguises, and I followed with my hand on the revolver in my coat pocket. Silas Crook operated from the first floor above a ship's chandler on Narrow Street. The stairway was dark and steep, and the door at the top bore no nameplate, only a brass slot for letters and a peephole at eye level that slid open the moment Holmes knocked. "Who are you?" said a voice from behind the door. It was a sharp voice, wary and quick, the voice of a man who expected trouble and had learned to assess it through a 2-inch hole. "Sherlock Holmes. I am here regarding Victor Hargrove." A silence, then the click of 2 bolts and a chain, and the door opened to reveal Silas Crook. He was not what I had expected. Moneylenders in the popular imagination are stooped, greasy creatures who rub their hands and speak in whispers. Crook was none of these things. He was a small, wiry man of perhaps 55, clean-shaven, with close-cropped grey hair, and eyes of a peculiar pale brown that reminded me of a ferret's. Quick, intelligent, and entirely without warmth. He wore a plain dark suit that was scrupulously clean, and his hands, when he gestured us to sit, unbolted to the floor, and a shelf of bolted to the floor, and a shelf of ledgers arranged with mathematical neatness. There were no ornaments, no pictures, no concessions to comfort. It was a room designed for one purpose, the transaction of money, on terms favourable to its occupant. "Mr. Holmes," Crook said, settling behind his desk with the contained stillness of a man who does not waste motion. "Your reputation precedes you. I assume this is about the dead cousin." "It is about Victor Hargrove's debts." Crook's thin lips compressed. "My dealings with my clients are confidential." "Your dealings with your clients are unlicensed," Holmes replied calmly. "You are not registered as a money lender under the Act of 1872, Mr. Crook. Your rates exceed the legal maximum by a considerable margin. And at least 3 of your current debtors have been subjected to threats of physical violence by men in your employ. I have no interest in your lending practices. That is a matter for the police. But if you decline to answer my questions, I shall make it my interest, and I promise you the result will be disagreeable." Crook regarded Holmes for a long moment. His pale eyes were very steady. Then something shifted in his expression. Not fear, exactly, but the cold calculation of a man weighing the cost of resistance against the cost of cooperation. "What do you want to know?" "How much does Victor Hargrove owe you?" £800. The figure hung in the air. £800 was a staggering sum, more than most men earned in 5 years of honest labour. I saw Holmes absorb it without visible reaction, but I knew the number had confirmed something he had suspected. When did the debt originate? 3 months ago. Victor came to me after his uncle fell ill. He said the old man was dying and that he expected a substantial inheritance. He wanted to borrow against it, to cover debts he had accumulated with other creditors, and to fund what he called necessary expenses in anticipation of taking over the estate. I lent him 400 initially, and he returned twice for additional sums. The total now stands at 800, plus interest. And the terms of repayment? I gave him until the end of this month. The interest accumulates weekly. If he cannot pay, I shall pursue him through the courts, or through other channels. Crook's voice was flat and without emphasis, which made the threat more chilling than any bluster could have. You threatened him with debtor's prison. I reminded him of the legal consequences of default. A man in my position must protect his investments. And Victor's response? Crook leaned back in his chair and folded his small, precise hands. Victor Hargrove is a man of extraordinary confidence and very little substance. Each time I pressed him, he assured me the money was coming. Once the estate is settled, he said, once the transfer is complete. He believed, or claimed to believe, that the inheritance was a certainty. And then the will was read, and Albert was named heir instead of Victor. Yes, Victor came to me 3 days after the will reading, white as paper. He said there had been a complication, but that he was resolving it. I told him complications did not pay debts. He asked for more time. I gave him until the end of the month and not a day beyond. Holmes leaned forward. Mr. Crook, I want you to think very carefully about what I'm about to ask you. 2 days before Albert Hargrove was murdered, that would be Tuesday of last week. Did Victor visit you? Crook's pale eyes narrowed. He did. And what did he say? He said... Crook paused, and for the first time I saw something other than calculation in his face. It was the faint, involuntary discomfort of a man who has begun to see the shape of something ugly. He said, "You'll have your money within the fortnight. Yeah, the matter will resolve itself." The words settled into the silence of that bare, cold office like a stone dropped into a well. "The matter will resolve itself," Holmes repeated softly. 2 days before his cousin was strangled on a dock. Thank you, Mr. Crook. You have been most illuminating. We descended the dark stairway and emerged into the grey Limehouse street. Holmes walked in silence for several minutes, his hands deep in his pockets, his jaw set. "You £800, he said at last. "That is the weight that broke him. Victor borrowed against an inheritance he expected to receive, and when the will gave it to Albert instead, he was trapped. Crook's deadline is the end of this month. Debtor's prison, or worse, awaited him. He could not wait for legal channels. He could not contest the will. The only path he saw was to remove Albert before the deed transfer and claim the estate through intestacy. And he did not know about the secondary clause. He did not know, and so he killed for nothing, but the debt explains the urgency. This was not a crime of hatred, Watson. It was a crime of arithmetic. Victor calculated that one life, his cousin's, was worth less than £800 and 1,200 acres. He was wrong on every count, but by the time he learns it, the noose will already be around his neck. Our next destination was altogether different. We returned to Barking and to the Hargrove cottage, where Margaret received us in the same front parlour, the fire burning low, and Patch curled motionless on the rug. Holmes sat across from her and spoke with a gentleness I had rarely heard from him. "Mrs. Hargrove, when I was last here, I asked about your correspondence with a gentleman in Colchester. You refused to discuss it, and I respected your decision. But the investigation has progressed, and I must now ask again. I do not believe your letters are connected to your husband's death, but I must be certain." Margaret was silent for a long time. The fire cracked and settled. Patch raised his head, looked at her, and lowered it again. "His name is James Poole," she said at last, and her voice was very small. "He is my brother." Holmes waited. James was imprisoned 2 years ago for debt. He owed money to men he should never have dealt with, and when he could not pay, they had him arrested. He spent 18 months in a debtor's prison in Chelmsford. He was released 3 months ago, broken, ashamed, with nothing to his name. She paused and drew a breath that shook. I have been sending him money from my own savings, the small amount I set aside each month from the housekeeping, 20 shillings here, 30 there, enough for him to take a room in Colchester and look for work. And you hid this from Albert? I was ashamed, Mr. Holmes, ashamed of my brother, ashamed that he had been in prison. Albert was a good man, but he had strong feelings about debt and those who fell into it. I was afraid he would think less of James, or of me. Holmes did not respond immediately. He sat very still, his gaze fixed on the middle distance. And I recognized the expression, the look of a man who has seen a connection and is deciding whether to follow it. Mrs. Hargrove, the men to whom your brother owed money, do you know their names? Margaret's face tightened. James would never tell me. He said it was better that I didn't know. He said they were dangerous people. Would you recognize the name Silas Crook? The effect was immediate and unfeigned. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. That was the name. James mentioned it once. In his lowest moment, just before the arrest, he said Crook had shown him no mercy. I felt the hairs rise on the back of my neck. Holmes leaned forward, his eyes alight. Your brother was imprisoned for debt to the same moneylender, who now holds Victor Hargrove's note for £800. Margaret stared at him. I don't understand. What has Victor's debt to do with James? Perhaps nothing. Perhaps a great deal. Crook is a spider at the centre of a web, and the Hargrove family has become entangled in more than one strand. Holmes paused. I must ask you one more question, and it is important. Did your brother James ever meet Victor Hargrove? Never. James lives in Colchester. He has never visited us here. He is too ashamed. And Albert? Did Albert know about James's imprisonment? Margaret's composure, which had held through grief and revelation, finally broke. Tears spilled down her cheeks and she pressed a handkerchief to her face. Albert found out 3 weeks ago. He found one of James's letters in my sewing basket. He was not angry. Albert was never angry, but he was troubled. He said debt was a chain that dragged men under, and he worried that James would pull us down with him. We argued. It was the only argument we ever had. She drew a ragged breath. And now Albert is dead, and the argument can never be mended, and that is the thing I cannot bear. Holmes rose and crossed to the window, and he stood with his back to us for a long moment, and when he turned, his manner had changed. Softer, more deliberate. Mrs. Hargrove, your brother is a fortunate man to have such a sister. These letters are entirely innocent, and they will play no part in the investigation. But the connection to Crook is a thread I must follow to its end. I do not believe James is involved in Albert's death, but I must verify it, as I have verified every other lead in this case. May I see the letters? Margaret left the room and returned with a bundle of perhaps 15 letters tied with a plain ribbon. Holmes untied them and read through each one with the swift, absorbing attention he brought to everything. There was nothing in those letters but the ordinary, painful correspondence of a sister trying to help a broken brother rebuild his life. Arrangements for money orders, news of James's search for work, cautious expressions of hope. Holmes retied the bundle and handed it back. These letters confirm what you have told me. Your brother is in Colchester seeking honest employment and grateful for your help. There is nothing here to connect him to the events at Blackwater Docks. He paused at the door. I'm sorry to have caused you distress, but I would rather follow a thread to its end and find it innocent than leave it dangling and wonder. Margaret took the letters and held them against her chest. Will you find who killed Albert, Mr. Holmes? I will, and when I do, you will know that your husband's death was not random, and it was not meaningless. It was the act of a specific man driven by specific motives, and that man will answer for it. We walked back to the station through the fading afternoon. The sky above the marshes was streaked with copper and grey, and the first stars were appearing over the estuary. The Crook connection, I said. Coincidence? I do not believe in coincidence, Watson, but neither do I believe that every intersection of lives implies conspiracy. Crook is a moneylender who operates across the eastern counties. It is not remarkable that two members of the same extended circle should independently fall into his web. The coincidence tells us something about the world these people inhabit, a world where debt is a constant presence and men like Crook are its predators, but it does not alter the shape of the case. You are satisfied that Margaret's secret is unrelated. I'm satisfied that it is unrelated to the murder, but it is not unrelated to the story, Watson. Margaret's secret tells us something important about Albert Hargrove, about the kind of man he was, and the kind of household he kept. Here was a man who discovered his wife had been hiding her brother's disgrace, and his response was not rage but concern, not for himself but for his family. A man who worried about being dragged under by debt was murdered by a cousin who was drowning in it. Holmes shook his head. The ironies in this case are not accidental. They are the natural product of a world where money warps every relationship it touches. All red herrings cleared, I said. Slade, Lindquist, Margaret, all innocent, all accounted for. The field is empty now, Watson. Only one man remains standing, and tomorrow we lay out the evidence in its entirety. The case against Victor Hargrove is complete in all its parts. What remains is the presentation and the trap. Chapter 8. The Reconstruction. I have often remarked that there were two distinct phases to a Sherlock Holmes investigation, the gathering and the weaving. The first was the restless, physical labour of collecting facts, the crawling over crime scenes, the interrogation of witnesses, the pursuit of every thread, however fine. The second was the moment when Holmes drew all those threads together and showed how they formed a single, unbreakable cord. The first phase was work, the second was art. Wednesday morning at Baker Street belonged entirely to the second phase. Holmes had risen before me and cleared the breakfast table. In its place he had arranged a series of objects with the precision of a museum curator. The envelope containing the tarred hemp fibres, his notebook open to the boot print measurements, a copy of the solicitor's letter, the paper template of the dock platform he had sketched during our first visit, a timetable of the London, Tilbury and Southend Railway, and a large-scale map of the Blackwater Docks area, upon which he had marked distances and routes in red ink. He stood behind this display with his hands clasped at the small of his back and addressed me as though I were a jury of one. 8 clues, Watson, 8 threads. Let me show you how they weave. He picked up the envelope first. The tarred rope fibres, extracted from the ligature wound on Albert Hargrove's throat, consistent with the mooring ropes used on the river barges at Blackwater Docks. The killer used a weapon sourced from the immediate environment, not brought with him, but selected in advance from materials he knew would be present. This tells us the killer had prior familiarity with the docks, and planned to use a weapon that would be impossible to distinguish from its surroundings. He set down the envelope and moved to the notebook. The boot prints, 2 sets on the dock, both size 9, both with the chevron sole pattern of boots purchased from Grafton's in Barking. Albert's prints show a stride of 31 inches, evenly distributed. The second set shows a stride of 28 inches, 3 inches shorter, with a pronounced left heel bias. Albert walked with an even gait. The second walker had a shorter stride and favoured his left leg. Holmes looked at me. Victor Hargrove has a slight limp in his left leg, the result of a childhood riding accident. His natural stride would be shorter than that of a man of equal height who walks without impediment. Key and the boots, Albert's spare wading boots, were stolen from the garden shed during Victor's visit the previous Wednesday. Mrs. Phelps saw him walk through the garden under the pretext of admiring roses he has never once shown interest in. He moved to the solicitor's letter. The untouched letter. Albert carried in his coat pocket a document confirming that he was days away from inheriting 1,200 acres. His watch was untouched. His coin purse was full. The killer took nothing. because the killer was not a thief, and the killer left the letter because removing it would have pointed directly at an inheritance motive. The killer already knew about the inheritance. He had been present at the will reading, and he calculated that leaving the letter would support the fiction of a random dockside attack. Holmes turned to the map. The alibi gap. Victor claims he arrived at the Creekmouth Inn at 8:15. The innkeeper confirms the arrival, but reveals that Victor did not sit down to eat until 20 to 9. 25 minutes spent in the back, ostensibly washing his hands. He arrived breathless and with a dark stain on his collar that had vanished by the time he sat down. Holmes traced a line on the map with his finger. The distance from the fishing platform to the Creekmouth Inn is precisely 1 mile, at a brisk walking pace, and Victor was breathless. So we know the pace was brisk, that distance takes 18 minutes. Albert was killed between 7:30 and 8. If Victor strangled his cousin at 7:45, spent 3 to 5 minutes disposing of the rope and removing the stolen boots, and then walked briskly north, he would arrive at the inn at approximately 8:15. The 25 minutes in the washroom gave him time to scrub the tar from his hands, change or turn his stained collar, and compose himself before appearing for supper. He moved on. The dog, Albert's terrier, Patch, was found lying calmly beside the body. A terrier will bark at strangers, especially strangers who attack its master. Patch did not bark. Patch did not react, because the killer was not a stranger. The killer was someone Patch knew well. Victor visited the Hargrove household regularly. The dog knew him and trusted him. Holmes picked up his notebook again and turned to a different page. The warehouse ledger. Victor signed the visitor's log at the Blackwater Docks warehouse office 3 times in the 2 weeks before the murder, claiming to inspect a storage lease that had expired 6 months earlier. The warehouse clerk confirms that Victor did not visit the storage bay on his last 2 visits. Instead, he walked towards the fishing platforms. He asked which platforms were in use, who used them, and when the dock was quietest. He was not inspecting a lease. He was conducting reconnaissance, learning Albert's schedule, studying the layout, and identifying the location of mooring ropes on the adjacent barges. He turned the page. The foreman's log. Thomas Slade, the dock foreman, has confirmed that Victor visited the foreman's office on his second trip to the docks and asked to see the foreman's log, a document that recorded, in official detail, exactly who used the fishing platforms and when. He did not ask for cargo records, which is what his stated purpose would have required. He wanted the platform schedule. He wanted Albert's routine confirmed in writing. Finally, Holmes set down the notebook and clasped his hands behind his back. The debt. Victor owes the moneylender Silas Crook £800, borrowed against an inheritance he expected to receive. When the will named Albert as heir instead, Victor was trapped. Crook's deadline is the end of this month. Debtor's prison awaits him. And 2 days before the murder, Victor told Crook, "The matter will resolve itself." He was not speaking of legal proceedings or family negotiation. He was speaking of murder. Holmes stood in silence for a moment, looking down at the assembled evidence on the table with an expression of grim satisfaction. 8 clues, 8 independent lines of evidence, each pointing to the same man. Tarred rope fibres from the docks where Victor scouted the ground. Boot prints matching stolen boots worn by a man with Victor's limp. An untouched letter left by a killer who already knew its contents. An alibi shattered by 25 minutes of frantic washing. A dog that did not bark at a familiar face. A warehouse ledger proving premeditation. A foreman's log confirming he studied the victim's schedule. And a crushing debt that provided the motive. He looked at me. The case is complete, Watson. But a case is not a conviction. Yeah, we need the murder weapon. We took the afternoon train to Barking. Holmes was silent for the journey, his face set with the focused intensity of a man approaching the final act. At Blackwater Docks, he led me directly to the fishing platform where Albert had died. The body was long removed, but the chalk marks Holmes had made on the planks were still faintly visible, pale scratches on the dark wood like the last traces of a life erased. Holmes did not linger on the platform. He walked to its edge and looked down at the barges moored at Berth 4, the same 3 flat-bottomed craft we had observed on our first visit. Their decks were cluttered with the accumulated detritus of river work, tarpaulins, chain, buckets and rope, dozens of lengths of rope, coiled, looped, tied to cleats and bollards and stanchions, all of it the same tarred hemp that had left its fibres in Albert Hargrove's throat. Holmes climbed down from the platform onto the deck of the nearest barge with the agility of a man half his age. I followed, less gracefully. For 20 minutes he moved along the gunwale, examining every length of mooring line, lifting each coil, running his fingers along the rope and studding the knots. I watched him work and said nothing. He stopped at a cleat near the bow. A length of rope was tied there in a serviceable knot, unremarkable among the dozens of similar lines on the vessel. Holmes untied it and held it up. "Here," he said. I looked. It appeared identical to every other rope on the barge, but Holmes turned the end towards me and I saw what he had seen. The cut was fresh. Where every other rope on the vessel showed frayed, weathered ends, the natural aging of hemp exposed to water and air. This rope had been cut cleanly recently, and the end had begun to fray only slightly. Moreover, the knot that had secured it to the cleat was tied differently from the others. The bargeman used a standard figure 8. This rope was tied in a simple overhand, the knot of a man who knew how to tie a rope but was not a waterman by trade. "Cut from this barge within the past 2 weeks," Holmes said, "used to strangle Albert Hargrove, then brought back and tied among its fellows, where it would be invisible to anyone who did not know precisely what to look for." He coiled the rope carefully and placed it in his leather bag. "A needle in a stack of needles, Watson, but every needle has its eye, and this one has just been threaded." Holmes then walked me from the fishing platform to the Creekmouth Inn, timing the journey with his pocket watch. We walked at a brisk pace, not running, but the purposeful stride of a man in a hurry. The route followed the dock path north. He passed the warehouses, along a muddy lane that skirted the edge of the marshes and up to the inn's front door. Holmes clicked his watch closed. 18 minutes and 20 seconds, precisely as I estimated. He sent a telegram to Lestrade from the Barking post office. I did not see its contents, but Holmes told me its substance as we waited for the return train. "I have asked Lestrade to arrange for Victor Hargrove to be brought to Blackwater Docks tomorrow evening, Thursday, under the pretext of identifying some of Albert's recovered property. Victor will come because he believes himself safe. He will come because a guilty man cannot resist returning to the place where he believes he got away with murder." Holmes's grey eyes were hard and bright in the lamplight of the station platform. "And when he stands on that dock, Watson, I shall take him apart." Chapter 9. The Trap at Blackwater. Thursday evening came in with fog. It rolled off the estuary in slow, heavy waves, swallowing the marshes and the docks until the world beyond 10 yards ceased to exist. The warehouses became dark shapes without edges, the barges vanished into grey nothing, and the fishing platform where Albert Hargrove had died stood over black water that could no longer be seen, only heard, a soft, rhythmic lapping against the pilings. Holmes had positioned us with care. We arrived 2 hours early, while the last dock workers were still clearing out. Lestrade waited at the foot of the platform with 2 plainclothes constables stationed behind the nearest warehouse, out of sight, but within earshot. Holmes and I stood on the dock itself, at the far end where Albert's body had lain. The fog pressed against us like something alive. "The setting is perfect," Holmes murmured. "Precisely as it was 1 week ago tonight. The fog, the hour, the solitude. Let Victor feel it." Let the place do its work on his nerves before I do mine. At 7:30, the very hour at which Albert Hargrove had been killed, we heard footsteps on the dock path. 2 sets, Lestrade's measured official tread, and another, lighter, more hesitant. A moment later, 2 figures materialized out of the fog. Lestrade, solid and watchful, and Victor Hargrove. Victor wore a dark overcoat with the collar turned up. He walked with his hands in his pockets and his shoulders drawn in. His eyes moved over the dock, the water, the barges, and came to rest on Holmes with an expression of polite cooperation. But I saw the muscle in his jaw working, and I saw his gaze linger on the spot where his cousin had died. "Mr. Holmes," he said, "Inspector Lestrade tells me you've recovered some of Albert's property and wish me to identify it." "I have recovered something, yes," Holmes said. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Hargrove." "I show you what we found. I wonder if I show you what we found. I wonder if you might walk me through your movements on the evening of the murder once more, for the official record." Victor recited his alibi with smooth fluency. The Creekmouth Inn from 8:15, supper, the innkeeper, home to Stratford by cab. 8:15, Holmes repeated, "and you went directly to your table?" "More or less. I washed my hands first." "Ah, yes, the warehouses." Holmes reached into his leather bag and produced the green cloth ledger from the warehouse office. He held it open under the lamplight so that Victor could see his own name signed 3 times. "You visited the warehouse office on 3 occasions in the fortnight before your cousin's death. Each time you cited a storage lease." Victor's eyes fixed on the ledger. "I was considering renewing the lease." "The lease expired 6 months ago. You never filed renewal paperwork. The warehouse clerk confirms that on your last 2 visits, you did not go near the storage bay. Instead, you walked towards the fishing platforms." Holmes's voice remained even. "You asked the clerk which platforms were used for fishing, who used them, and what time the dock grew quiet. You asked whether the barges at Berth 4 were permanent moorings, and you consulted the foreman's log, the document that recorded Albert's exact schedule, his precise hours on this platform, week after week." Victor said nothing. His jaw had stopped working. He stood very still. "I wonder, Mr. Hargrove, if you would do me the courtesy of walking the length of this dock, from here to the far end and back. A small request. It will take only a moment." "Why?" "Humour me." Victor hesitated. Then he walked the length of the fishing platform. His gait was smooth enough to a casual eye, but not to mine. I saw it clearly. The slight shortening of the stride, the fractional dip on the left side, the deeper press of the left heel against the planks. The childhood limp, so slight as to pass unnoticed in ordinary life, but written into every step like a signature. Holmes had been watching too. He produced from his bag 2 plaster casts, the moulds he had made of the boot prints during our first visit to the crime scene. 2 sets of prints were found on this dock on the night of the murder, he said. Both size 9, both chevron soled. Albert Hargrove's prints show a stride of 31 inches evenly weighted. The second set, made by someone wearing Albert's spare wading boots, now stolen from his garden shed, shows a stride of 28 inches with a pronounced left heel bias. Holmes held up the casts. "Your walk just now, Mr. Hargrove, matches the second set precisely, the shortened stride, the left heel pressure, the signature of a man with a limp in his left leg." The colour had drained from Victor's face. In the lamplight and the fog his skin had the grey, waxy quality of tallow. But his voice, when he spoke, was still controlled. "A coincidence. Many men have uneven gaits. Many men do not have tar stains in the creases of their right palms." Holmes stepped forward, and before Victor could react, seized his right hand and turned it palm upward. Even in the dim light, the staining was visible. Dark lines in the skin creases between the fingers, at the base of the thumb. "Stockholm tar, Mr. Hargrove. The same compound that coats the mooring ropes on these barges. The same compound whose fibres I extracted from the ligature wound on your cousin's throat. Holmes released Victor's hand and reached into his bag once more. He drew out the length of tarred rope he had recovered from the barge, coiled, dark, and heavy. This rope was cut from the barge at berth 4 within the past 2 weeks. It was used to strangle Albert Hargrove as he sat fishing on this dock, then retied among the mooring lines, hidden among dozens of identical ropes. The cut is fresh. The knot is wrong. The fibres match the wound. He held the rope towards Victor. Would you care to explain how tar from this rope came to be ground into your skin? I touched a railing at the inn. The railings are... The Creekmouth Inn has no tarred railings. I checked. Victor's mouth opened and closed. His eyes darted to Lestrade, to me, to the fog-shrouded dock behind him. The composure that had served him so well across 3 encounters was crumbling now, falling away in pieces like plaster from a rotten wall. Holmes pressed on. The innkeeper confirms you arrived breathless at 8:15 and spent 25 minutes washing in the back before sitting down at 8:50. I have walked the route from this dock to the inn at a brisk pace. It takes 18 minutes and 20 seconds. If you strangled Albert at 7:45 and walked briskly, you would arrive at precisely the time Burroughs recorded. The 25 minutes were not the ablutions of a fastidious gentleman. They were the frantic efforts of a killer scrubbing tar from his hands. "This is speculation," Victor said, but his voice had risen and his hands were shaking. "I have tarred fibres from the wound matching these ropes, boot prints matching your gait in stolen boots, a warehouse ledger proving you scouted this dock 3 times, a foreman's log confirming you studied Albert's schedule, a moneylender who will testify you owe him £800 and told him 2 days before the murder that the matter will resolve itself, an innkeeper who will swear to the 25-minute gap, and a dog, Mr. Hargrove, your cousin's terrier, who lay beside his body and did not bark, because the killer was not a stranger. The killer was family." Victor had backed against the railing of the dock. His face was a mask of something beyond fear, but it was not the wild, screaming fury of a cornered animal. It was something worse. It was the slow, terrible stillness of a man watching the last wall collapse. He said nothing. His eyes were fixed on the rope in Holmes's hand, and his breathing had gone shallow and rapid. "And now," Holmes said very quietly, "I will tell you the part you do not know. You killed your cousin believing the estate would pass to you through intestacy. But Cornelius's will contains a secondary clause. In the event of Albert's death before the transfer, the estate passes entirely to Albert's surviving children. Not to you, to Edward and Clara, held in trust until they come of age." Holmes let the words settle. "You strangled a good man for an inheritance you would never have received. Cornelius anticipated you. He knew your debts and your character. He built a wall around that estate you could never have breached. You murdered Albert for nothing." Victor Hargrove did not scream. He did not lunge. He stood perfectly still against the railing, and something behind his eyes simply went out, like a candle flame pinched between 2 fingers. His shoulders, which had been drawn up tight against his neck, dropped. His hands, which had been trembling, went limp at his sides. He looked at Holmes with an expression that held no rage and no defiance, only the blank, exhausted recognition of a man who has run a very long way and arrived at a locked door. When he spoke, and his voice was barely above a whisper, and it carried the terrible calm of absolute defeat, "Cornelius always was cleverer than the rest of us." It was not a confession in form, but it was a confession in every other respect. Lestrade stepped forward. The 2 constables emerged from behind the warehouse. Victor did not resist. He held out his wrists with the mechanical compliance of a man who has ceased to care what happens next. Victor stopped once and looked back at the dock path. Victor stopped once and looked back at the platform. He did not speak. He stood for perhaps 3 seconds, staring at the spot where his cousin had died, and his face in the lamplight held an expression I've never forgotten. Not remorse exactly, but a kind of bewildered recognition, as though he were seeing for the first time the full shape of what he had done and finding it incomprehensible, even to himself. Then Lestrade took his arm, and they walked on into the fog, and the sound of their footsteps faded until there was nothing left but the lapping of the water and the distant cry of a gull. Holmes stood at the edge of the platform, looking out over the black water. He had not moved since Victor's whispered admission. His face was composed, his breathing steady. But I knew him well enough to see what lay beneath the composure, not triumph, but the particular weariness that came over him at the close of a case where justice, though served, had come too late to save the man who deserved it most. "It is done, Watson," he said at last. "Let us go home." Chapter 10. The Inheritance. 2 weeks passed. The autumn deepened into something closer to winter. The trees along Baker Street surrendering the last of their leaves to a wind that blew cold and steady from the north. London wrapped itself in fog and coal smoke, and went about its business, as London always does, indifferent to the small dramas of justice and grief that play out in its courts and parlours and prison cells. Victor Hargrove sat in Pentonville Prison, awaiting trial for the murder of his cousin Albert, whom he had not confessed. His solicitor had advised silence, but the whispered words on the dock had been witnessed by Lestrade and 2 constables, and the physical evidence assembled by Holmes was, as Lestrade put it, when he called at Baker Street to give us the news, enough to hang him twice over. "The prosecution is confident," Lestrade said, standing by the fire with his hat in his hands. He looked 10 years younger than the haggard man who had first brought us the case. The tarred rope, the boot prints, the warehouse ledger, the foreman's log, the moneylender's testimony, the innkeeper's account of the alibi gap. It all fits together like a Chinese puzzle. The Crown prosecutor said he has rarely seen a more complete chain of circumstantial evidence. "It is not circumstantial in every link," Holmes corrected from his chair, where he sat with his long legs stretched towards the fire and a pipe in his hand. "The tarred fibres are physical evidence, directly connecting the murder weapon to the docks. The boot prints are physical evidence, connecting the stolen boots to a walker with Victor's gait. The warehouse ledger and the foreman's log are documentary evidence of premeditation. Only the timing and the motive are circumstantial, but taken together, the chain is unbreakable." "The jury will have him before luncheon on the first day," Lestrade said with satisfaction. Holmes said nothing to this. He drew on his pipe and watched the fire with an expression that held none of Lestrade's satisfaction, only the quiet, inward look of a man whose thoughts have moved past the mechanics of prosecution to something more difficult. "There is one matter remaining," Holmes said after Lestrade had gone. "The children." It was on a grey Thursday morning, 2 weeks to the day since Victor's arrest, that we attended a meeting at the chambers of Mr. Josiah Trent on Throgmorton Street. The occasion was the formal confirmation of the inheritance under the secondary clause of Cornelius Hargrove's will. The office was as I remembered it, panelled, sober, lined with deed boxes and the accumulated paperwork of decades of careful legal practice. Trent sat behind his desk with the will and its codicil spread before him, his steel-rimmed spectacles catching the light from the tall window. Across from him sat Margaret Hargrove, dressed in black, her face composed but marked by the particular exhaustion of a woman who has endured 2 weeks of grief, investigation, revelation, and the discovery that her husband's own cousin had taken his life. Beside her sat the children. Edward Hargrove was 12 years old, a quiet, serious boy with his father's sturdy build and his mother's dark, watchful eyes. He sat very straight in his chair with his hands on his knees, and there was about him a stillness that spoke not of childish obedience, but of a premature gravity, the bearing of a boy who has understood that the world has changed and that something is now expected of him that was not expected before. Clara was 8. She sat close to her mother, her small hand resting on Margaret's arm. She had Albert's face, the same plain, open features, the same expression of quiet attention, and when she looked at Holmes it was with a directness that I found unexpectedly affecting. She did not fidget. She did not speak. She simply watched, with the solemn patience of a child who has learned that adults are conducting business on her behalf, and that she must wait for them to finish. Trent read the relevant passages of the will aloud, translating the legal language into terms the family could understand. Under the primary clause, new Albert Hargrove had been named sole heir to the Hargrove estate. Under the secondary clause, executed as a private codicil and witnessed by 2 partners of Trent's firm, the estate, in the event of Albert's death prior to the completion of the deed transfer, would pass in its entirety to Albert's surviving children, Edward James Hargrove and Clara Ann Hargrove. The estate comprised 1,200 acres of farmland and marshland in Essex, including the Hargrove farmhouse, 3 tenant farms, grazing rights on the marshes, and riparian rights along 2 miles of river frontage. At current valuations, Trent estimated the estate's worth at not less than £4,000, a sum that would have been beyond Albert's imagining during his lifetime as a shipping clerk. Margaret would serve as custodian and trustee until Edward reached the age of 21. The tenancies would continue under their existing terms. The farmhouse would be maintained, while the land would be managed by an agent appointed by Trent's firm until the children were old enough to make their own decisions. In practical terms, Trent concluded, removing his spectacles and folding them carefully, your children are now landowners of considerable means, Mrs. Hargrove. The estate is well managed, the tenants are reliable, and the income is sound. Edward and Clara will want for nothing. Margaret nodded. That rose from his chair with a formality that would have seemed rehearsed in a man, but was entirely natural in a boy of 12 who has been raised by decent parents. He crossed the room to where Holmes sat and extended his hand. "Thank you, Mr. Holmes," he said, "for finding who killed my father." Holmes took the boy's hand and shook it gravely. "Your father was a good man, Edward. The evidence of that is in every corner of this case, in the loyalty of his dog, in the devotion of his wife, in the respect of his neighbours, and in the fact that a very wise old man chose him, above all others, to inherit the land that now passes to you." He held the boy's gaze. "Take care of it, and take care of your mother and your sister." "I will, sir." Clara had risen too. She did not offer her hand. She looked up at Holmes with those steady, solemn eyes and said, in a voice that was very small but very clear, "Patch misses him." Holmes was silent for a moment. Then he said gently, "I know." We left Trent's chambers and walked out into Throgmorton Street. The city was loud around us. The clatter of wheels on cobblestones, the shouts of messengers, the dull roar of a million lives being conducted simultaneously within the square mile. Holmes walked beside me with his hands clasped behind his back and his chin lowered, and he said nothing for a long time. We took a cab back to Baker Street. The sitting room was warm, the fire freshly laid by Mrs. Hudson, and the familiar clutter of our shared existence lay about us like the evidence of a life that, whatever its eccentricities, was at least our own. Holmes removed his coat, hung it on the hook, and crossed to the window where he stood for some minutes looking down at the street. "Justice, Watson," he said at last, not turning from the glass. "I should think so," I replied. "The killer is imprisoned, the children are secured, the estate passes exactly as Cornelius intended." "Justice," he repeated, as though testing the weight of the word. "A man is dead because his cousin could not bear to see good fortune fall upon someone other than himself. 2 children will grow up with land and money and every material comfort, but they will not have their father. He will not teach Edward to fish. He will not walk Clara to her first day of school. He will not sit at that dock on Thursday evenings with his dog at his feet and his line in the water, content with a life that asked nothing of the world but the world's ordinary kindness. He turned from the window. That is the mathematics of murder, Watson. It never balances. I had no answer for this. In truth, there was none to give. He stood by the window a moment longer. Then he crossed the room to the corner where his violin case lay open on the side table. He took up the instrument, turned it in his hands, and set the bow against the strings. The music that came was not the tortured scraping of a restless mind. It was something else entirely, a slow, melancholy air, quiet and deliberate, that rose and fell like breathing. I did not recognize the melody. It may have been his own composition, or it may have been something half-remembered from a concert long past. I sat in my chair and listened, and the fog pressed against the windows of 221B Baker Street, and the fire burned low, and the music filled the room with a sorrow that was also in its way a kind of grace. Outside, London went on.